Nat and I, the name is again Rap News 30. Nat and I were involved with a conference in the year 2000 which sought to bring out ideas towards Accra as we enter the 21st century. I saw a reference to it on the slide when we were beginning. We call it Visions of the City, Accra in the 21st century. And you will find the ideas which came out quite intriguing. But if I'm to summarize what Accra needs, like any major city that should work, it's revitalizing the urban systems of transportation. You cannot have a city of 2 million, 3 million that depends on small-bodied public transport system like trotro and taxis which take 3, 4 passengers. You can also not have a city like Accra that doesn't have a modern sewer system. You cannot have a city of 3 million that doesn't have water supply that can't even run. And of course, lately, we have the challenge with power. These are key components that drive any city anywhere in the world. So really, are we there? You and I will agree that we are not there. So how do we start? Let's go back to the drawing board. And I think it's a major aspect of what we need to do. I would not even want to talk about architecture. I want us to concentrate on this, the very basic things that can make a city, a modern city work. And we have friends here who have seen cities that work. They all have their challenges, but there should be some basic denominator that should make these cities work, that we should aim at. My pet complaint in the past 10, 15 years, because I was involved with the Registration Council of the Ghana Institute of Architects. And we are seeing several things happening in how the setbacks to plots, how frontages to homes and houses are all being converted into commercial ventures. And the question is,
I mean, when they came to settle, there were so many, they looked like ants. You know, so the Fantis, I'm a Fanti, we say Nkran, or we say Nkran, we call the people of Accra ants, black ants, Nkran. And in fact, they call themselves that. Culturally, traditionally, the people have their own identity. They'll tell you they came from Israel, they'll tell you they used to be by the Nile, they still pour libation and say Nile. And these are people whose identity is totally lost when you look at the architecture. If you look at the city, there is nothing in this city that tells you where we were, where we've been, where we are, and where we are going. I am a photographer. I see all these spaces. I happen to have lived in a number of them. I also happen to have had to hire an architect to design something for me. And my experience with what I had was almost like a copy and paste system. Oh, you want a 2-bedroom this, or you want a 3-bedroom that, okay, I have this design, we can modify. Or we can, this copy and paste system. And I was asking myself, so when you wake up, when you sleep and you wake up as an architect, what inspires you? If I go to bed, if somebody was to tie me up and put me in the back of a boot and take me somewhere, wherever, and I wake up in the morning, how would I know I'm in Accra? What, if I look out the window, what is distinguishable? What stands out? All I see is concrete everywhere. And for me, it tells of a constipation of the mind. There is no creativity. We have all these beautiful elements that are not tapped. You enter a building in a tropical country, and the building is totally sealed up in concrete, and you have all these air conditions running, and we are complaining that there isn't enough electricity. We have this beautiful water body called Koli, and we've gradually watched this water body die. People still go there every year to do homo and pour libation, and the water is dead. And I ask myself as an observer, what are we doing? Where are we going? I'm not an architect. I'm not in a position to answer questions. But as a frustrated Ghanaian who has seen a lot of Africa, and I've seen how sometimes you are in Mali and nobody has to tell you are in Mali. Everything tells you are in Mali. You are in Accra and you are lost. And so, Knut, I'm sorry, but I didn't come with answers. I pretty much came with questions too.
Why? God knows. But those are a lot of questions. Those are a lot of questions. And it's too easy to try and rationalize one's way around it. Osei, do you have any response?
Well, Kofi, thanks for your questions. But you're right. Probably 300 years ago, you could identify Accra because it was just the indigenous people who settled in Accra. But you should also ask yourself that 300 years ago, or let's not stay 300, about 100 years ago, the market was the center of every settlement. In 2013, the market is still the center of Accra. That tells you a huge disconnect. There's nowhere in this world where land values went over $3 million an acre is used for selling tomatoes or onions. Right? So there's a huge disconnect. Now, once you lose track of where you're from and where you're going, we begin to get lost. And like you rightly said, we're totally lost. I mean, almost every major city in this world survives on its culture. Whether you take Barcelona, or Madrid, or Sydney, or London, London survives on this culture as far back as the 16th century. So there's a reason why those cities have what they have. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen here, because basically the indigenous culture is lost. Whether you blame the indigenous people themselves or whether development has overtaken them, I'm not too sure. But it is very necessary that you integrate them into the development, because that is what, for some reason, is the soul of the city. It's become cosmopolitan, and therefore you realize that there are other aspects of other cultures that probably will overtake what was indigenous, but you cannot run away from it. You can safely identify what is in the Volta region, or what is in the northern region, or what is in the Ashanti region. When you come to Accra, it doesn't exist. I can tell you that a place like Barcelona or Bangkok survives on what is traditional to the people, which is food, music, dance, drink. Basic to any city that has any cultural value. When you come to Accra, it doesn't exist. Okay? Now, it can't just happen. You need to sometimes make a conscious effort to make sure that the indigenous settlements or the indigenous people is integrated. When people walk to London to see Buckingham Palace, that was 300 so many years ago built. It's the tradition of the royalty that keeps London's tourism going. Okay? So if it has been successful, or when you go to Prague, okay, or you go to Paris, or you go to New York, it's a tradition that has started several years ago, that has been built upon and has been consciously developed to arrive at this point. Okay, so the point you made is right. Somehow, like I mentioned, there's an issue of governance. Too much of virtually everything that must happen in the city is in the hands of central government. Now, I'll make this point, which is unfortunate, but it's reality. People begin to mistrust central government when they're not happy with their well-being. And this was illustrated a few days ago in Ashima. When Cantonment got bent, and when Agovilish got bent, the people decided to rebuild it themselves because they did not trust central government will do it the way they want. Now, it's unfortunate. Yesterday, you saw what happened in Egypt. It's all about spaces and people's well-being. Okay? And how people survive in what you call a city. And therefore, you cannot allow the city to crawl and develop the way you think it should be. No. You know what happened in Turkey? You've heard what is happening in Brazil. So, you must find a way to integrate people's sentiments. And in this particular case, we're talking about the Gas or the indigenous people of of Accra into the city's development. If you're not able to do that, you may be sleeping. If you listen to Milosevic and the issues that came up in Yugoslavia, and the poem that he said about the hills and his fathers, you realize that problems can be latent. And in 20, 30, 50 years, it will explode. You need to avoid that. That's the point I just made.
Agent of this city. But in all honesty, I find it a little embarrassing to talk about giving Accra a Ga culture simply because he constitutes such a small minority here. The Gas constitute roughly 15% of Accra. Accra is the biggest Akan city in the country. It's full of Akans. So if there is any culture which should inform the growth of the city, it's Akan culture. And it is doing so in music, in your addiction to funerals. Accra is becoming quite a funerary place. So there are all kinds of little changes going on. And I'm struggling with this whole notion of what role the indigenous culture should play. Because we are also grappling with the world that is changing exceedingly fast. And it's changing us with it. Should we look back and try to go back to an imagined life of what? Pristine purity? Or should we take the future by the horns and move with it? Let me get my planner. Let's see.
When it comes to the industry of death in Ghana, I believe that actually should be further promoted. I think that one of the unique things about Ghana is our fascination about funerals and death. So rather than curse it, I think we should bless it. And the way in which I think we should bless it is as follows. In some cultures, the state of being dead has been celebrated in very interesting ways. You find old cemeteries in storied cities where they become even almost like promenades where people go to visit the dead, learn about people. There's one particular cemetery, I don't remember where it is. I think it's in Buenos Aires. But also, I think that if we can find a way to celebrate it, like how, let's say, the Mexicans celebrate the Day of the Dead, and the Liberians have the Memorial Day where they actually go to the cemeteries and clean them up. I think that if we could find a way to do the same in Ghana, I believe that, first of all, the management of all cemeteries should be passed on to all the churches. Churches, mosques should have stewardship of all cemeteries. I believe that if they were in charge of these cemeteries, I think they'll be kept cleaner. Secondly, I think that if we could find ways to celebrate the Day of the Dead, our past people, knowing that, for example, we have infamy when it comes to, or fame when it comes to coffin making. So it's something that we can sort of mark up. I think that's a thing we should definitely try to do. I even believe that they should almost be like, well, I think first of all, immaculate cemeteries will grow out of this particular attention to the idea of death, but it will also create a. I have an article I wrote for a magazine that I published, and there are a whole bunch of ideas I have for tourism and keeping the city vibrant. So I think one of the ways in which to do that is to not shy away from the issue of death. I also think that when it comes to Accra, I think that, like I was mentioning earlier, we seem to have a social life that is basically event-based. Somebody dies, they have a funeral, have a party or whatever else. You can't just walk into Accra and say, okay, I'm going to have a cup of coffee or have a cup of of a cup of cocoa, not cocoa, but cocoa powder. And we don't have even, if let's say you go to Addis, there are cafes all over the place. Coffee is their national drink. And you can walk anywhere in Addis, sit upon a cafe and have a nice cup of coffee. I would like to see places where there are indigenous cocoa cafes. Maybe we could sit around and enjoy something of that nature. So I think that we have to, one of the things we need to do is we need to switch our socialization from event-based to incident-based, where you can just happen upon things in the city. And those things, of course, you have to really have like detailed plans and initiatives to have that realized. It doesn't just happen out of the blue, you know.
We have talked quite a bit here on the panel, and I think we should not keep switching on and off. We should get the audience involved, letting them have their say. Please, if you want to say something, just raise your arm. I would ask you, you just introduce yourself briefly, and then there's a mic over there. Okay, over there at the back.
We are all here with questions without answers, so we have to look for answers. And one of the speakers made it clear that that I can attest to, that the directions are all in the hands of the authorities. I mean, those who take decisions. So the interesting thing is that no matter what we do here, no matter what we say here, it still will be around us. How do we get these information to the authorities? I mean, those who take the decisions. Because Accra, as it is, like one would say, 30 years back, when some of us were kids, maybe 40 years back, when some of us were kids, when you get to Accra Central, Jamestown, Kolegono, it has been the same. It has been the same, no changes. What you see is maybe adding to concrete, if you ask me. What do we do? How do we get these areas in the modern structures, and how do we finance it? How do we get it done? So it's all questions. Maybe I'll say something else again, but then that is another question I'm throwing out.
Our development plan for our own city, not having bridged the 19th century to the 21st century, really puzzling, first of all. And I'm going to echo a lot of what the photographer said, because I feel that is the problem, that we do have an identity crisis. I'm, really young in what it is I'm starting out as my profession, but then I see it in everything that it is that we do. We are still clinging on to, in this particular period of our, of the city's life, the architect's role as the designer, as the builder, rather than as the thinker, as the researcher. And for me, that's really why we haven't been able to move past point A down to point B and then linking up the dots. I think a lot of what this series does for us is give us the opportunity to, line up solutions. But, and so that's where I'm going to start with. When I think the architect should transition into the thinker or the researcher. I think that's a very important role that we have to start to occupy. There's a multifacetedness to what architecture is. And I don't think that we're giving it much power. We aren't empowering ourselves as architects, or as thinkers, or as designers, artists, photographers, whatever. 2 years ago, I think it was, I was fortunate to be part of a competition that re-envisaged the city. Unfortunately, the only reason why I was able to take part in this competition was because it was not contextualized. So meaning I was able to, design based on where it is I felt the response was needed. And for me, that was Accra. A very good example is what the photographer talked about as being Koli Lagoon, which in some years would have been likened to the Thames. And for some reason, they've been able to re-envisage what the Thames is for London. And why not for, Accra, Koli Lagoon, which is a very important, vital water body for us. That was mostly what a lot of my envisaging was based on, Koli Lagoon. I think if we can see more of these competitions for young architects, for professionals in this architectural industry, we can do a lot more to think up identities for the city and, you know, help put something together. Thanks.
My name is Miriam, inhabitant of Accra since a little bit more than over 5 years. I enjoyed this discussion, all the opinions, what everybody thinks about beautiful Accra. What I miss in the panel and with the other discussants is, where's the ownership? Where's the self-responsibility? Or the filth? Why don't I see people sweeping in the street? Why don't I see people cleaning up their own mess, making their own space better? There's so many possibilities, but I just don't see them. And as long as habitants don't start, whether indigenous or not, I mean, architects, of course you can blame architects, the governments, but it's each household, each backyard who needs to be cleaned up by ourselves to start with. I believe so.
Later on, but and these are also not my ideas, but from a friend who's a developer here in Accra. And I also admit my ignorance in terms of how the system actually works. But the first is, would it change things if the mayor of Accra was elected democratically? And secondly, my understanding is that there's a pretty much negligible, almost non-existent property tax. And do you think that if there was a more substantial property tax within the city of Accra, that might also sort of have a radical impact in terms of Accra's development?
Last comment by Vera pretty well slips into the young lady who was surprised at my comments about Accra, the 19th and the 20th century. Accra, the laws by which the city is ruled were essentially set up at the end of the 19th century when the British declared this the capital of the Gold Coast. They wrote certain laws to make Accra easy to manage at that time. And to a large extent, these laws, give or take a clause or two, are still very much on our books. The city have more responsibilities than is capable of fulfilling. And because it cannot fulfill these responsibilities, it chooses to ignore some and enforce some of them. Today, as we sit, the city is the only legally constituted body that can build a market. So, most neighborhood markets are supposed to be built by the city. What is Accra Mall, if not but a market? But it's a market belonging to a totally different century, and the city isn't even looking at that. It's penalizing the Cantamantons and the Makolas with laws, with taxes that are onerous and cannot be easily met, and not providing a lot of services, the services that you get in other places. And that's what I mean by the city is being shackled. The question was asked, why the mayor, would it be better if the mayor was elected? Of course. You cannot have a city of this size. You cannot have a city with the ambitions that Accra has, of being a financial center, of being a cultural center, of being a political center, when the mayor is basically acting at the behest of the president and is not answerable to the people over whom he holds sway. You cannot have a mayor who can raise taxes when he has no way of using these taxes directly, but he has to go through a common fund and be redistributed. So there are all kinds of rules and regulations that ties the city into a very strict 19th century way of ruling a colonial town. And today, we are pretending to be part of a global world where speed of communications, where speed of action, where ease of facilitating movement is the norm. And all that we are talking about cannot be resolved by making the city mayor elected. But an elected mayor will be more responsible to the people over whom he
rules, and that will help to bring us into the 21st century that I'm talking about.
And someone there raised the basic issue of sanitation, infrastructure, how we build, and what we are doing. My opening statements focus on some of these things, and I'm quite passionate when it comes to some of these issues. As we sit here, if I have the money and I can go to DVLA and I can go to AMA, and I have 10 small Nissan cars, and I pay all the fees and what have you, and I want to use them as taxis in Accra, there's no policy to stop me from doing that. These cars are going to take nothing more than 4 times 10 passengers and clog the city roads, whilst one bus can do the same, and there will be less traffic and less pollution. Then let's take even housing. Everyone who wants to build, even in the center of Accra, is not thinking of anything multi-story that can maximize the use of the land and the infrastructure. If he's redoing the family house, he builds and takes it to AMA. And what does it build? In the middle of Accra, 2-story building. Surely, there are cities in this world that do better. There are several cities where the minimum that you can get in the city center, not because you say that's what should be done, but you have to look at the land value and you have to look at the infrastructure and how you are servicing all of these things and decide that naturally there's a minimum that makes it uneconomic if you go beyond that. So we should start by looking at these things again. Right now, there are several roads in Accra which, by the latest planning law, it isn't even a law, it's something the AMA is operating. They are the so-called ceremonial streets, like Independence Avenue, Kwame Nkrumah Avenue, and several of them. If you take your plans to develop to AMA, they will tell you that the minimum story height you should have is 4-story. But that is not the issue. The issue is that what are we doing to make sure that the city is developing along what can be accepted as well-laid plans that can be sustainable? Then we go to I've talked about transport, I've talked about development. Then let's even go to sanitation again, where we don't have a modern sewer system. Every house, every development is thinking of a septic tank. Which modern city in this world still relies on sewage? In the 60s, when I was growing up in Accra, a sewer system started. That time it was being done by the Israelis and by our own local African Union business. Egypt went to war with Israel, and Israel, for that matter, was occupying the Sinai Peninsula in some parts of Egyptian territory. With solidarity with Israel, or rather with solidarity with Egypt, rather, the OAU decided that we should sever relationship with Israel. So in the middle of that project, which was being done by Israel, Ghana, rightly or wrongly, we cut diplomatic relationship with Israel. And that sewer system stopped. They had virtually done just a little over a third of it. And Accra was even smaller. Up to today, we haven't gone further. So less than 10% of Accra, the land we have, has a sewer system. And that starts with cantonment, going along the gradient and ending up next to the Koli Lagoon. How do you run a modern city that way? So you need to again find that, much as I don't really want to shift everything on national government or whoever rules it, we need to go and revisit these plans to be able to have a modern city before we can talk about developing this city along lines that can be sustainable. But if we allow every person to develop the way he wants because he has his money, he can buy 10 cars and run 10 taxis, or because he has his money and can decide that in the middle of Accra, he's building nothing more than 2-3 stories. And for that matter, you go further and find that he decides that, again, in the middle of Accra, he creates a small shop as a frontage, irrespective of the setbacks and some basic issues that we need to tackle in a way that can give us a framework within which we can now begin to move forward. And again, I would say that whether it's from the AMA, whether it's from whoever deals with national development planning in Ghana, every city in Ghana, up to the district assembly, should make use of its development plans in the way that you can work along those lines within a framework. Not that today there is a change in government and we have affordable housing, another government comes and decides that, oh, instead of affordable housing, I'm going to have SDS. Within a period where all the former affordable housing are abandoned up to today, the SDS doesn't take over and we're looking for solutions. Whoever comes next then starts talking about new plans. Government, as they say, is continuous. And you should have a system like they have elsewhere, whether it's Democrat, whether it's Republican, that there's a framework within which everybody has stepped down. That's the way to go. Not that I come and I bring my own policy, irrespective of whatever is in the system. And I think that basically is part of our problem.